All right, hey everybody, JMac coming at you here again with some refactors. I'm sorry this didn't get out on Friday. I'm kind of like 50% on getting the actual refactors live on Friday. And normally, if I don't make it live, I end up just kind of recording it later. So I'm going to do my best to try to keep the Friday schedule. But if not, rest assured there will be a video at some point during the week that I'll share and announce on Twitter. So what I did want to work on last Friday was something for Shift, and we actually covered this in a earlier episode, or I guess at least started this in an earlier video. And let me just bring up kind of what I'm noticing. So again, in an earlier video, I refactored some stuff to use events, and one of the reasons I did that is because I'm using MailChimp. I have some newsletter subscriptions, and I want to make sure to subscribe new users when they're registered to a particular list. I want to tag users when maybe they've started a subscription or take them off when they've canceled that subscription, and tag them maybe with individual Shift purchases as well. And again, I use this newsletter package, which is from, I'll probably butcher it, unfortunately. It's from Spasi, I think is the way they say it. But anyways, Frake is the author, and I actually reached out to him when I built or contributed these add tags bit. It was a feature that wasn't in there, and obviously one I wanted to use. So that was kind of the whole reason behind this is, first of all, I'm still using MailChimp. I know there's a lot of other mail services out there, but I still use MailChimp. So this integrated with that nicely. And again, I kind of already started getting familiar with the package as well as contributing in a way. So I found an opportunity for another contribution, and that's where I want to kind of get started with this video today. And the issue is that basically when I go in and trigger that user registration, so I'm just in my local development environment here, and I'm going to sign in with GitLab because I know that's going to force a new user registration. So I'm going to click this, and what happens is I get this invalid MailChimp API key supplied. Now, this isn't necessarily my fault as the developer, and it's not the package fault either. What this is actually a limitation with MailChimp. They don't have a sandbox API. So there's really no way for me to set up a test API key that kind of just goes nowhere. I can use my production API key and send things to kind of a default list or a test list. But in my opinion, that's pretty nasty because then you really mix and match data. Due to their plan pricing and limitations, maybe I somehow push myself over the subscriber limit and I'm automatically upgraded to a more costly plan. So it's just not a very good option. So instead, what I want to do is I want to contribute again to the project. I've already reached out to Frake and asked, hey, what do you think about this change? And we kind of decided on a path through already. So what I'm going to do in this video is scratch my own itch here, fix this annoying little bug, because up till now, over the past few weeks, I've really just been commenting that out because a lot of the times I don't have to re-register the package. So or sorry, I don't have to actually subscribe a user, and so because of that, I'm not really hitting this workflow very often, but again, this is pretty annoying when it happens. So instead of going in here and commenting these lines kind of one by one, I'll actually kind of start up by creating a fake way to do this, right? Or again, contributing to the package. So I kind of thought about this, and again, talked with Frake a little bit about it. And what I want to do is kind of mimic what Laravel does. This is a Laravel project, and if we look at something like the mail configuration, there are actually some different drivers that you can use. One of which is the log driver. The queue, for example, also has other drivers as well. The null queue driver, so it just kind of goes nowhere. So I want to incorporate these into this newsletter package. So that way, when I'm calling newsletter subscribe or tags or whatever, depending on the log or the null driver, these things don't actually happen. But if I need them, or if I need to confirm that I called it a certain way, maybe I could use the log driver, right? And ideally, this shouldn't affect any of my tests or anything because I'm already using the built-in Facade fake to allow me to kind of swap these out during testing. So testing's not the issue. The issue is when I actually want to run my real application in a development or a testing environment or a staging environment even, I don't want to get kind of this annoying MailChimp API key, but I also don't want to use my real MailChimp production key to test in those environments, right? So let's go ahead and start kind of setting this up. And what I'm going to do is another kind of difficult thing when you're working on packages is there's no clear way to kind of add this behavior because I need a real world application to kind of test that I'm on the right track. But if I start contributing to this directly in the project, or sorry, the package source code, I'm not really going to be able to trigger those types of things. So what I'm going to do is spike on it here, the actual code in the vendor folder, and then once I've kind of proven that out, I'll swap projects and we'll make the actual contribution and test it out appropriately to the package itself and open up the pull request. So that's kind of the goal of this video. But again, I wanted to demonstrate at a high level what the problem was, you know, kind of what the need is and my plan to go about it in the application context. And then we'll get down to kind of the lower level code. So if we go down to Spassie's directory in the vendor folder, and we can see inside of here, basically everything gets loaded up in the service provider. And again, this is very common in Laravel applications. Even packages leverage these to register themselves. And in this case, they're registering that newsletter facade to a newsletter class, which is effectively bound to the container as a singleton. And that basically calls a callback. And I've kind of looked at this a little bit before the video, but just to prove I'm on the right track, if I go into this new newsletter, look, there's that exception with that exact message, invalid MailChimp API key supplied. And I would have known that anyways if I kind of just looked at the stack trace here to see that that's the newsletter service provider line 24. It's even highlighted for me here, that low level thing that I'm highlighting in PHP Storm. But if we go to newsletter service provider line 24, boom, there it is right there. So again, because this API key doesn't exist, you know, I can't really make a new thing. But again, I don't want to supply it a API key. And even if I supplied it a crappy API key, when these calls, again, actually tried to execute, they would fail because of an invalid API key just farther down the line. So it's just not really an option to try to fake these out. And I don't want to write any kind of logic in my own application of like, hey, if you're the test environment, rebind this other thing. I'd really like the package to be smart about it, just like the mail, you know, facade and the queue facades, all these other facades that are built in the framework are smart enough about that already. So it'd be nice if this package was as well. So again, that's what I want to contribute. But just to spike on this, the goal is effectively to load in some kind of driver based on the config. So I would be able to call something like config newsletter driver. And basically if that was null, right, is the null driver, or if it was the log driver, then I would load up this new null driver. And it doesn't have anything in it right now. It's not even real, but just so we can actually kind of test this, what I'm going to do is make a new PHP class. I'm going to call it null driver. It's going to be in the Spassie, I think I'm saying that right. It's going to be in the Spassie newsletter path there. So this should all be linked up correctly. Yep, good. Okay. And then we need to, actually, again, I wrote this earlier just to pass it off Frake, but let's do stash pop. I've modified, again, for this application, my newsletter config, and I've added this MailChimp driver. And the default, of course, is to use the API driver, but there are opportunities to use the log or null driver. Now, I haven't built all that directly because this is just a spike, but I want to prove that by default, you know, this is just going to do the right thing. But if I go in and kind of override this MailChimp driver environmental variable and set it to log or set it to null in this case, that I would no longer get kind of this annoying method or message. So we actually have this loaded. Maybe I have this already. Let me demonstrate this in my .env.dev. Oops, that's not opening. .env.dev. There we go. So I actually already had this set. Let me pull this out though, and we'll just demonstrate. Again, we're getting, okay, so we're getting invalid MailChimp API key, but everything's kind of set up from this spike. We have this new MailChimp driver. I'm going to re-enable that back in the MailChimp driver. I'm going to set it to null. Now this is an interesting thing about the env. This is actually explicitly null. It's not a null string. It's actually being converted to null, the actual language construct. So that's actually why, if you were wondering, I did an is null check here and not something like equal to the string null, because .env is actually casting that down to null directly. So if I refresh this, we get a different error message, but that's okay, because subscribe is actually attempting to be called on this null driver. And so my plan here is really, as far as this null driver, like, it's really just kind of a null object pattern. So it's one of those things where I might be able to do this a little more cleanly, but all I really have to do in here is leverage the PHP magic methods and basically say something along the lines of, again, just for this spike here, I'll just dump this out. But the point is, instead of an exception being thrown, this magic call method is just going to catch everything. And I basically just don't do anything inside here. And if I refresh the page, I should now be registered and I got into my application. So I'm not getting that. Now, if I were to, let's say, for example, log out and go to .env, and let's just take this out, for example, and I try to log in again, this time with GitHub, but that'll be a different user, I'll get that API key. So that's the spike. We've kind of proven that this works. So what I want to do is actually swap over to the package code base directly. Let's change that down here on the command line as well. And what I'm going to do is do a git checkout -b. We're going to call this null driver. And now I've got a good place to do some work here. And what I want to do is just be a little bit more thorough about testing this out. So notice that there's no test for that service provider. Now, ideally, in an ideal world, in a perfect world, this would actually be tested, because there's a little bit of a logic here, whether this is through an integration test or some other kind of test. The point here is that this would give me back some kind of object that I could test against, right? And I could do that if I had the application up and running and I asked the container for a newsletter instance, and then I could assert that, I got the same one back over and over. That would kind of prove out singleton. Another thing I could do is, this is actually a injected app is injected into the service provider constructor. So I could mock this out and make assertions that this stuff was called. Now, I've actually done this before, so there be dragons is kind of the point. What the problem is we're actually kind of mocking something at such a low level that you end up in this scenario where you're having to mock multiple objects, multiple aspects of the framework. And I'll tell you, the one that's the real kicker is config. If you're using any kind of helper method that's not really part of the package, and it's leveraging the fact that it's ultimately going to live inside of a Laravel application, things like config path and config, other types of things that you might call, are probably not going to be available to mock or even use the real thing on, because they just don't exist. And again, I could prove this out by kind of going through that setup, but we'd really end up in kind of just a nasty place. So again, we could do this. So just real quick, you can kind of get a hint that I could do this, and we could do config path, and I could start rewriting this so it were mockable. But the relationship between the test and this implementation is going to be so tightly coupled that if someone ever came in here and changed this to be the helper config instead of config git, where I could fake or swap that out with the standard Facade spy, if they changed it back, it's just all not going to work. So it's going to be very brittle, is the point I'm making. So unfortunately, this is not a good avenue to kind of test all this. So let me just back this out. Now, something else I could do inside of here to just get a little farther down the rabbit hole would be to do something like where I could return this, or I could return some kind of like driver manager. I already hate this name. Create or something. And this manager could be injected, and I could make sure it got called and stub it out and make sure that all my binding was correct here. But I'm just going to run into the same issue because all I've really done then is just deferred all this config issue to be at a lower level. So then when I went to test the device manager, I would still have the same issue. I wouldn't really be able to read from config directly. And maybe I pass in some kind of config accessor to that, to that object. That would be the way you would do it from a unit test perspective. What I'm going to do though is just I'm going to punt on this because two reasons. One, we've seen that it's super, super complicated and it's really testing the wiring between the package and the application, which is honestly just not something that happens at this level. So that's kind of the first reason. The second reason is there's really kind of already not tests for this particular path anyways. And there's a fair amount of logic that's being tested here. They're setting, this verify SSL property. They're creating a new config lists manager or configured list. They're passing that into kind of this object, and they're never really making any assertions on the logic that's here. So while I hate to kind of pile on additional logic here that is going to be untested, I'm not really breaking suit with the package just yet. So the point is, I'm going to punt on this for a second. I'm just going to drop in the code that we had before. So I'm going to say config newsletter dot driver. Basically, if it's null, so we had that before. So let's just say is null, and we'll start there, and then we'll basically just return this new null driver. So I'm just being really, really simple here with just a very simple check. Again, without those tests, I just want to be super sure, but I can at least test this null driver aspect. So we're going to go ahead and create this class. It's going to be a null driver. It should go in the source directory, which it did. That's perfect. I don't need this constructor because I'm not actually doing anything with it just yet, so I'm just going to rip this out. And I need to make sure now with tests that when I call this null driver, it doesn't necessarily explode. I can call it with a couple different things and it's going to do, something. So let's make a test for that. So I'm going to do new PHP test, and we're going to make it on this null driver. It's going to be null driver test. All that's good. We're going to let PHP Storm kind of create this for us. Unfortunately, they still use that PSR0 namespace, so I'm going to drop this out. And we're just going to do something. Again, I want to follow suit with a test that exists already. Whoops, it put that in the wrong spot. Let's fix that. So this is under the test namespace. Boom. All right. And then let's follow suit again with the test they have. So they have this tests annotation instead of using the test prefix. So I just want to make sure I'm doing the same thing. So let's do public function, and we'll just say it can be called with any method. And we will just do something along the line of like subject equals new null driver. We're not going to pass in anything because it doesn't take anything. And then we're just going to do something like this assert null because it doesn't do anything. And we'll say something like subject whatever, and we'll do subject subscription and something else like a real thing like add tags, and we'll pass in some kind of parameters here too, right? So like JSON at testing.com, and let's pass in an array of tags. So tags. So again, this null driver is a little bit it's a little bit dangerous in the fact that if you didn't have tests in your application, like because this accepts anything, it's not really verifying, your code was written correctly. So that's not the goal here, is the point I'm making. The goal here is to assert that the null driver can really just be called with a completely arbitrary method and completely arbitrary arguments and basically just not blow up. So it's a pretty weak test from that perspective. But again, the goal is that it at least exhibits that type of behavior. That's really all I care about. As long as it exhibits that behavior, then I know that it's basically not going to blow up. So I'm not happy with the overall test kind of coverage or even the implementation of the test, but it's something that gets it off the ground. So we swapped over here. Let's do vendor bin PHP unit, and we get an exception, and it says call to undefined method whatever. So line 15, and that makes sense. This very first line when we call it with whatever is just not going to work out for us. So let's fix that, and we'll implement that magic call method and basically do nothing. And we're green. So again, super simple test that's happening here. I really would like to add some more coverage to it, but I'm just not exactly sure what that would look like in the moment, honestly, because ideally what's most important is this piece. It would be nice, I suppose, if this maybe implemented some kind of interface, and then I would be able to know, like, you called with this kind of, you had to call a method that had this particular name, right? And if it had that name, then cool, and if not, I would actually throw an exception. And then I would be able to kind of beef this test out a little bit more with some requirements. But because, again, at the end of the day, this is a null driver, which can technically just be called with anything, it's one of those situations where, because of that super loose requirement, there's just not going to be a good test that I can write over here. So it is ultimately solving the problem that I have, though. So again, I am going to add one more thing to it, just because maybe you do want some kind of log driver. Maybe the null driver is just a little bit too loose. So let's drive it out with just a little more functionality, just for fun, and then I'll go ahead and create the pull request here. So what I'm going to do is pull this off, and I'm just going to var that off and basically call it the driver. And basically, if the driver is null or the driver is equal to log, then I effectively want to create this null driver. And what I'm going to do is pass in this additional parameter. So if the driver is equal to log, then I actually am not just going to want to completely do nothing. I'm still going to do nothing, but I actually am going to log that particular thing has been called. So we're getting a little bit of an issue here, so let's go ahead and drive this out properly. So this is all fine, but what we want to do here is add another test, and it can be called with any method. It logs, let's change this to be it logs the method invocation or method call when log is set. There we go. And what we'll do is just pass in a true here. And so now we're going to do all that. That's fine. But we also need to basically set up a log facade. So we can do that here, and we can say spy, and we'll do something along the lines of, like, what can we say here? We can say log should receive a call to whatever. What is spy doing? Is it returning the actual spy? It swaps it out. So it has should receive. I'm looking for like a should have received because I don't really care about mocking it ahead of time. So I think what I could probably do is just get this log spy and use it directly. I think spy on the facade returns ultimately the mock or the spy. So let's do that. Let's do should have received. There we go. So it should have received a call. Let's just make it a debug log, and it's basically going to get some additional arguments. So in this case, it's going to get a message, and so we'll say something like called Spassy newsletter facade method, whatever the method name is, so in this case whatever, and we'll say something like with, and we'll pass in some additional arguments. So in this case, there's no additional arguments. So let's just make sure I'm on the right track. I would expect it to fail here on line 30. Let's kind of see that happen. Actually, I would expect it to fail higher up because I haven't set up the constructor. So it did fail where I expected, line 30, which is good, but there's a couple things that are missing here. So first of all, the constructor is not running. So let's set up this constructor, and let's do that with a little bit of help from PHP Storm. And we're going to pass in log calls, I'll just call that, and we'll just say false by default. And we'll do something along the lines here of making this a field. Looks good. And I do think they use type hinting in this package. Let's just double check. So let me just go into like the newsletter. Yeah, there's MailChimp. Yeah, there's scalar type hints as well, string, array. So they're definitely heavily type hinted here. So again, I just want to follow suit. Anytime you're contributing to a open source project, I just like to kind of adopt their conventions. Even if I don't necessarily follow that in my own project, it doesn't matter. It's their code, and I want to respect. All the more reason to do so, simply for the fact that it's unlikely your feature will get merged or your pull request will get merged or approved if you're just doing something completely arbitrary or even against the kind of package conventions. So that should get us a little farther down the rabbit hole. Still going to fail on the same thing, but just to be thorough. Okay, so let's just throw a little log here, debug. Let's just make sure we're on the right track. And our message was called Spassy newsletter facade method blank. So in this case, that'll just be, that'll just be the name. And then we'll do with, and then we'll pass those arguments. Cool, whoops. All right, so I should get some weird failures here. First of all, the log facade's not found, so let's fix that. Second of all, now I'm failing where I wasn't failing before, so facade root hasn't been set. That's because it's calling this facade even though I didn't stub it out up top here. So I need to wrap, that's kind of driving me to wrap this in this condition. So basically, if log calls, then I would want to do this bit. And so it's basically wrapped now, so that initial test should not be failing. This is still failing on line 30, and I think it's just because I changed some of the wording there on the other side. There we go, so we're passing, cool. So now we should make sure that we receive kind of these other messages. So nothing's actually forcing me to do that right now. And I don't really need these extra ones. So what I'm going to do is to drive out the fact that the point is this is auto passing right now, even though I made this call, but I didn't really do like another receive. So anytime this happens, I want to just do something along the lines of like kind of clean these up. And I want to get that whole like, assertion, or sorry, where you kind of do the initial setup, you do kind of the calling or the action or the execution, and then you do your assertions. So it's basically like setup, execution, and then assertions. So the execution, though, is actually happening as part of the assertions, so that's just what makes this a little bit tricky. So the point is that I want to do something like should have received debug, and basically, or should have, I think they have a should have called debug twice, I think you can say. I think. Should call? Maybe not. Maybe I'm making all this up. So should receive. Let's do this. Let's do a should receive. And we'll do something like that. And that way, oh, I think I know. I ran into this issue the other day. If you don't do the teardown where you close mockery, it actually doesn't pick those up. So let's see if I'm on the right track here. So there's mockery. It's still passing. So it did receive debug twice. I guess it did call debug twice. It's just I didn't make the assertion on the other one. My goal here was to make sure that debug was actually being called, before the test was over, or that I was asserting on all of them. But there's actually kind of That's actually not really what I was after. I would have to turn this into a real mock to really get that rigidity to make sure that I'm not doing anything beyond the capacity of what's there. So that's kind of the difference between a spy and a mock. A spy is just going to kind of listen and play on, whereas a mock has to be specifically set up, kind of a certain way. So I don't have that rigidity with a spy. So it's not really actually the issue of this mockery close bit, although I should leave that in there just for completeness. I do want to make sure that this works as expected. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and write this assertion, and it's all the same name. This time it's going to be called add tags, and it's going to get some parameters. So in this case, it should get JSON at testing.com, and it should get the array of tags. So we're still passing, and just to kind of demonstrate that, if I put a empty array over here, this first one should be fine, but the second one should be an issue. And there we go. Spotty was called, the add tags was called with those things, but it never really received that. So this is working as expected, but it's just not as maybe rigid as I would want. So let's see if there's an opportunity to kind of make this a bit more rigid. So let's say log equals mockery, mock, and what we'll do is instead of this spy, we'll just do a log swap. So this is another method built into the framework, and we'll swap that out with log. And I'm actually okay with this just because I wasn't entirely sure if spy returned the log or the actual spy or mock object. It did, but this gives me just a bit more control, and I think now this is going to blow up a little bit better, yes. So if I were to call debug, kind of extra, so for example, I'm trying to prevent against this. So not here. So right now that's working because I swapped this over to something else, but well, it's actually failing up here because again, I don't have the facade set. So let's put this inside here. And the point is that this is passing because I haven't really finished setting up debug. So again, just to demonstrate this one more time, let me put this back as a spy, and my expectation is that this is all green. But the point is I'm doing some additional stuff here with log. So just to recap there, if that was a little bit strange, the point is that the mock gives me the rigidity that if I am doing more with that mock object than has been set up, then there's a problem, or I'm going to get an exception. So in this case, it's not even set up at all. So what I can do is I can say log should receive debug basically twice. And it's not receiving it twice. Oops. Log arrow should receive. There we go. So debug any arguments should be called twice, but it was called 4 times. Good, we're on the right track. So let me get rid of that extra one. And now we're in a better place. So just a little bit of extra work there to tighten it up, but the goal here was to make sure that I'm not kind of arbitrarily calling debug in any other capacity. I'm only calling it when log calls is set to true or the null driver is set up to log the calls that it's invoked with. There's a very specific format that gets put out. Again, these might be changed by the time the PR is actually merged, but it just gives me, again, a little bit of rigidity and gives the developer a little bit of choice in the fact that they can make sure maybe too that these are actually happening. They're not just being kind of lost to dev null, sent to the ether. So I still wish there was a little bit cleaner way to do this. And again, there is a path through. It would just require rewriting the singleton to either use another object that's maybe more easily tested, or to change the convention used here of these helpers. And again, because I'm changing the convention and because this wasn't tested before, I'm going to wait on this. I'll bring it up in the PR notes, but it's just not something that I'm going to worry about right now, at least for this initial commit. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's do git add-p. So I've changed the service provider. Since there are no tests, I'm going to slow down here. So I'm basically looking at the newsletter config driver. Cool. And then I'm looking if it's null or if it's log, then I'm going to return a null driver. Now what's interesting, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, and again, this is another reason I like git add-p because it's making me slow down and think about this exact piece. there's two things I just realized. One, I need to update the newsletter configuration, which made me think to my second point. If you don't have this driver set up, like if you go to update this package, that driver, that newsletter driver option is not going to be set, and it's going to be null by default, which means you're going to be sent to your null driver. So I kind of don't like that. I don't like that because if this weren't properly, if you just ran like composer update and there was no like semantic version tagging and there was no kind of announcement, there would be a little bit of an issue here because theoretically you could roll this all the way to production and it wouldn't work, right? Because you kind of missed this newsletter driver. So I'm going to leave this alone again for now, but I am going to note that in the PR that because this is null and because config kind of returns null off the bat, it's something that this could kind of break. Well, actually, you know what? I could get around that by the fact that config takes an additional parameter. So let's have its default be that if it's completely not set, going to be API, and that'll avoid the whole issue. So that was actually what I was really concerned about. So that'll avoid the whole issue. Again, not tested, really hate that, but I know this will work. So I'm going to leave that alone. And then the other thing I thought of, again, I mentioned a second ago, is that this newsletter needs that additional API bit. So let's add that, and then I'll finish up the PR. So let's say the driver to use to interact with MailChimp, and I think I said something like you may use log or null to prevent calling the MailChimp I cannot type MailChimp API. There we go. Directly from development environments. There we go. Okay, I've got the reverse cascade going on here. And we'll just say driver, and we'll say env is going to be that MailChimp driver, and the default is API. So again, we're being consistent with the API being the default. I just kind of wish these were things that were kind of tested out. So, and then this is something, again, this can all be tweaked as part of the PR. So, but I'm following suit here with their other conventions to this MailChimp prefix. This driver convention is something Laravel uses. I've obviously built it into the service provider to look for driver. And I'm defaulting in here to make sure that if you just blindly kind of upgraded and didn't update your config, everything's going to end up being okay because it's going to default to API when it's not set at all. So everything should be good here, although this claims to have an error. Oh, I see. That's a separate issue. I think that's a PHP Storm issue. So let's finish up where we're going here. I'm going to quit out of this, and let's do git add-p again just to start over since I made some changes. So I've added the log driver. Let's just kind of read through this, make sure this is good to interact with MailChimp. You may use log to prevent calling the MailChimp API directly from your environment. Let's tweak that just slightly. So interact with the MailChimp API. You may use log to prevent calling the API directly from your environment. Okay, cool. Let's do that. So I'm going to say yes. And then we have this driver. We're bringing in config. I'm defaulting to the API. If it's null or it's strictly equal to log, then I'm going to build a new null driver and pass in that logging call by seeing if it's strictly log. So again, wish that was tested, but looks good enough to me on the surface. So we just have a generated little class here for null driver. We're using the log facade. Everything appears to be formatted well. Good. We have our tests for that null driver, so at least we offer some kind of coverage, just not 100% complete. And just to pick up those small tweaks there to the API, that looks a lot better. So let's do git commit -m, and we'll say create driver, and let's just add a, let's make a little bit better of commit message here. So let's do git commit amend, and we'll do create driver, configurable driver, configurable. Is that how you spell configurable? Configurable driver. This allows developer to specify a log or null driver. So in order to avoid calling the MailChimp API directly, since there is no sandbox, MailChimp API. All right, so this allows a developer to specify a log or null driver in order to avoid calling the MailChimp API directly from a lower environment, since there is no sandbox. MailChimp API. Okay, I like that. Cool. That's good enough for me. Git push origin head. I just want to complete the cycle here. So we'll do git open. This is just a nice little npm package that has been expanded upon. And we will do compare and create pull request. Let's make sure it's just my changes. So those are my changes. That looks good. Just that one commit. This is a little funky. All right, well, I'll just fix it by hand because it seems like this is, yeah, this is correct. So let's just copy this. And we'll paste this up here, and we'll take out those line breaks ourselves. Again, my fault for force pushing. Thank you for sticking with me there for a second. We're going to create this pull request, and there we go. Everything should be good. If there are any, looks like I already have some style CI issues. So yeah, just some extra line breaks, and looks like they like those Laravel no spaces between the concatenate operators. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up. I'll force push yet again, but we'll kind of see how this goes, and I will leave a comment here to kind of talk about the fact that this is somewhat of a breaking change potentially, and call myself out on the fact that I didn't really add those tests for that service provider. But again, thanks for sticking with me through those. It was a little bit new territory there. So again, hopefully I'll get this PR out there. Follow me on Twitter to see more videos in the future, and of course also if this actually ended up getting merged in there. So thanks again. See you all Friday.